When Evan first invited me to spend a long weekend at his family's lake cabin, I hesitated. I'd been burned out. Too many late nights at the office, too many people talking over each other in the city, too many screens and never enough quiet. He'd said it would be just the two of us, some fishing, beer, and the kind of stillness you couldn't buy in a downtown apartment. That had sounded perfect. By the time I actually turned off the main highway and followed the narrowing road toward the lake, the sun had already started sinking behind the trees. It had rained earlier, and the air smelled like wet pine and earth. My phone lost signal somewhere between the last gas station and the first dirt turnoff, but I told myself it didn't matter. A weekend off the grid, that was the point. The cabin appeared at the end of a gravel drive, tucked among tall birches. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a single light glowed through the front window. For a moment I relaxed. Evan must have arrived early to get the fire going. I grabbed my bag, climbed the steps, and knocked twice before the door opened. It wasn't Evan. The man who stood there was older, late 40s, maybe 50, with lines that deepened around his eyes when the firelight hit them. His hair was dark at the roots and silver at the temples, a few days of stubble shadowing his jaw. He had the kind of build that came from work, not gyms, broad shoulders beneath a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, veins visible on his forearms. He looked at me for a second, assessing. "You must be Evan's friend." I blinked. "Yeah, I'm Jamie. I thought he'd be here." "He's not. Got held up in the city," the man said. His voice was low, even, with a rasp that sounded like gravel in warm water. "I'm Daniel, his uncle." "Oh, right." I remembered Evan mentioning him once, the uncle who'd built the place himself years ago, who still came up to keep it maintained. I hadn't expected to meet him, let alone be alone with him. Daniel stepped aside. "You've come this far. Come in." The cabin smelled of cedar and smoke. A fire burned steadily in the stone hearth, and rain pattered against the roof. I dropped my bag near the couch and glanced around. It was rustic but neat, handmade furniture. A small kitchen tucked behind the main room, fishing gear by the door. A dog's old collar hung from a hook. Daniel handed me a towel from a peg. "Storm's supposed to hit later tonight. Roads might get messy. You can stay if you're comfortable." I hesitated. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows. My phone still had no signal. "I guess I don't have much of a choice." He half smiled. "You city boys don't like rain?" "I like rain fine," I said. "Just wasn't expecting company." Neither was I. That hung there between us for a moment. Neither hostile nor welcoming, just honest. Then he turned back to the stove, where a kettle was beginning to hiss. I sat on the couch, the fire warming my legs. He poured tea into two mismatched mugs and handed one over. His fingers brushed mine, rough, calloused, warm. A small thing, but it caught me off guard. I murmured a thanks and focused on the fire. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees. Inside, silence settled heavy but not empty. Later, after unpacking a few things, I stood by the window watching the lake. It stretched into the fog like a sheet of slate, the far side lost in the mist. Daniel joined me quietly, holding a lantern he'd just filled. "She's calm tonight," he said, nodding toward the water. "But don't let that fool you. The storms here come fast." "She?" I echoed, half smiling. He glanced at me. "The lake. Everything worth knowing has a temperament." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. His words lingered anyway. When dinner came, it was simple: soup, bread, and conversation that drifted between polite and personal. He asked about my job, my life in the city, the noise. I asked about the cabin, though he spoke of it like a person more than a place. Built it 20 years ago, before the divorce, before everything changed. I didn't push for details. The pauses between his sentences were weighted enough. At one point, lightning flashed far off, and he rose to check the windows. I watched him move, deliberate, steady, like someone used to fixing things before they broke. When he came back, he caught me looking. "You'll get used to the quiet," he said. "I'm not sure I want to," I admitted. He studied me, the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. That's because you haven't had enough of it yet. Something in the way he said it, low, almost kind, made my chest tighten. I didn't know this man, but I couldn't look away from him. By the time we finished cleaning up, thunder had rolled closer. He threw another log on the fire and dimmed the lantern. Shadows climbed the walls, soft and uneven. I sat on the rug, closer to the warmth, while he leaned back in the armchair opposite me. The silence stretched again, this time taut with something I didn't know how to name. "You can take the bedroom," he said after a while. "I'll be fine out here." "I don't mind the couch," I said quickly. "Feels weird kicking you out of your own space." He tilted his head, studying me again. "Suit yourself." Another pause. The fire popped. I could feel his gaze flicker toward me, then away again. When our eyes met, just for a second, something unspoken passed through the air. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition. I looked down, pretending to adjust the mug in my hands. "So, you come here often?" "Every few weeks. It's quieter than most people can handle. Guess I'll see if I can handle it. I think you'll surprise yourself." His tone was gentle, but his eyes were searching. The kind of look that saw through small talk. I found myself fidgeting, fingers tracing the rim of my mug, half wishing Evan would walk through the door, half glad he hadn't. The thunder rolled again. Daniel stood, crossed to the window and checked the latch. His reflection in the glass was framed by lightning. A tall, solitary figure in warm flannel, the fire's glow cutting across his face. I wondered what it would be like to know someone like him. Not in passing, not in stories Evan told, but really know him. The thought felt dangerous, so I tucked it away. Later, when the storm broke in earnest, the lights flickered out. The cabin sank into darkness except for the fireplace. Daniel lit a lantern and set it between us. "You afraid of storms?" he asked. "No," I said, though my heart had started beating faster for reasons that had nothing to do with the weather. "Good," he said quietly. "They make you listen." I didn't understand until I did. The sound of rain against the roof, the crack of thunder, the rhythm of our breathing. It all felt sharper. The world outside vanished. There was only the cabin, the storm, and the space between us. He glanced at me, the lantern light catching the gray in his eyes. "You're a quiet one, aren't you?" "I just don't talk when I don't have to," I said. "Smart." He smiled faintly, and for a heartbeat, the air shifted. I looked away, pretending to watch the fire, but I could still feel it, the pull, the awareness. It wasn't romantic yet, not even clearly desire. It was something smaller and more dangerous. Attention. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, he leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, and said, "Get some rest, Jamie. Roads will be worse by morning." I nodded, murmured a good night, and retreated to the spare room. But sleep didn't come easily. From the narrow bed, I could still see the flicker of the fire under the door, still hear the wind, and somewhere in that rhythm, I kept thinking about the way he'd said my name. Low, careful, like he wasn't sure if he was supposed to. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I hoped he'd say it again. The storm didn't wait until morning. By the time I woke, the sound of rain had swallowed everything. The forest, the lake, even the wind. It was the kind of rain that felt endless, steady but powerful, like the sky had decided to wash the world clean. The cabin creaked under the pressure, but it held firm. I found Daniel already up, moving quietly in the kitchen. He was barefoot, sleeves rolled to his elbows, stirring something on the stove. The smell of coffee and frying eggs filled the air, grounding and unfamiliar all at once. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Morning," I echoed, rubbing my eyes. "You're up early." Couldn't sleep. Storms worse than they predicted. I glanced out the window, trees bending, waves lashing the dock, the lake a blur of gray. "Guess we're not going anywhere today." "Guess not." He slid a plate toward me and nodded for me to sit. "Might as well eat while we've got power." The lights flickered as if to prove his point. I sat at the small table, the hum of the generator and the patter of rain filling the silence. He cooked like someone who'd done it alone for years, measured, unhurried, precise. When he finally joined me, he didn't say much at first. We ate quietly, the clink of forks against plates the only sound between us. "You live in the city, right?" he asked after a while. "Yeah. Downtown. Crowded. Always." He smiled faintly. "I couldn't stand that. Too many people who don't know how to look at each other." I tilted my head. "You think people here are better at that?" "Not better," he said. "Just fewer of them. Easier to see what someone means when there's not 100 voices drowning it out." I didn't answer, but I understood. In the city, everything was noise. Here, every silence had weight. He refilled my coffee and leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Evan told me you're a writer." "Trying to be," I said. "Mostly editing now. Copy for a media firm. Not exactly poetry." "You strike me as someone who notices too much to fit in an office." That caught me off guard. "Is that good or bad?" He shrugged, a corner of his mouth lifting. "Depends what you do with what you notice." The lights flickered again, then steadied. The thunder rolled closer this time, deep enough to shake the table. Daniel sighed. "We'll need to check the shutters before the wind picks up." "I'll help," I offered. "You sure?" "You don't have to." "I want to," I said, maybe too quickly. Outside, the rain came sideways. We stepped onto the porch, and I could barely see the lake through the downpour. He handed me a rain jacket from a peg by the door. It hung loose on me, smelling faintly of cedar and something I couldn't name. We moved along the wall, checking each window, hammering down the loose latches. The air was cold and wet. Mud slicked beneath our boots. I followed his lead, clumsy compared to his practiced motions. At the far end of the porch, one of the shutters had come half loose, banging in the wind. Daniel leaned into it, trying to catch the hinge. I stepped closer to help, my shoulder brushing his arm. The contact was brief but electric, heat in the middle of the storm. "Hold that steady," he said, his voice raised over the wind. I pressed my hands against the wooden frame, the rain streaming down my sleeves. He worked beside me, close enough that I could feel his breath when he leaned in. For a second, our hands met on the same hinge, fingers wet, cold, and trembling. We both froze. The shutter slammed again, snapping the moment back. He tightened the bolt and stepped away, wiping rain from his face. I didn't move right away. When I finally looked up, he was watching me. Not in anger or surprise, but with something else. Curiosity. Restraint. I dropped my gaze. "Sorry." "It's fine," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, "You did good." We went back inside without another word. The cabin felt warmer now, the air heavy with wood smoke and wet clothes. Daniel tossed his jacket onto a chair and poured us both coffee again. I caught a glimpse of the scar on his forearm, a pale line running from wrist to elbow, thin and deliberate. "What happened there?" I asked before thinking. He looked down, surprised. "This? Old accident. Saw slipped when I was building the deck." "You built all this yourself?" "Mostly. Took me 2 summers. Hard work, but it kept me sane." He sank into the chair opposite mine, looking toward the fire. "After the divorce, I needed something that didn't talk back." The way he said it was almost a joke, but not quite. "What happened?" I asked carefully. He hesitated, then shrugged. "We wanted different things. She wanted city lights. I wanted quiet." I nodded. "You stayed." "She didn't." "Something like that." He smiled faintly. "We're better strangers than we were married." It was the kind of line that sounded rehearsed but wasn't. I could feel the truth under it. For a while, neither of us spoke. The rain softened into a steady rhythm, the fire crackling low. I watched the flames, trying to ignore how aware I was of him. The quiet strength, the stillness that wasn't cold but contained. He broke the silence. "You ever wonder if you're living the wrong life?" The question caught me off guard. "All the time," I said. He looked at me then, really looked. "What would the right one look like?" I wanted to answer, but I didn't know. Maybe quieter. Maybe closer to something or someone that felt real. Instead, I said, Still figuring that out. He nodded. Good. People who stop figuring it out usually stop living, too. Another rumble of thunder. The lights flickered once more and went out completely. The only glow came from the fire. Well, he said, standing. Guess we're off-grid for real now. He lit a few candles and set them around the room. The light softened everything. His features, the rough edges of the cabin, even the storm outside. The air felt heavier, slower. He poured whiskey into 2 glasses and handed one to me. For the nerves, he said. I laughed quietly. You think I'm nervous? He didn't smile. You breathe like someone who is. I didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't wrong. We drank in silence. The fire popped, the rain whispered, and every so often, our eyes met and drifted apart again. I kept trying to tell myself it was just the atmosphere, just the storm, just isolation playing tricks. But that wasn't true. He wasn't like anyone I knew. And that was exactly why I couldn't look away. Later, we sat by the fire again, both of us in different chairs but not far apart. He told me about growing up out here, how he used to fish in the mornings before school, how his father had been a quiet man too. You learn to listen before you talk in a place like this, he said. City doesn't teach that, I admitted. Everyone talks to fill the silence. He looked at me, expression unreadable. Maybe that's why you came here. The thought hit harder than I expected. Maybe I had come to fill some kind of silence I didn't understand yet. The rain pounded harder, echoing on the roof. Lightning flashed through the window, and for an instant, the room lit up in silver. He was watching me again, and this time I didn't look away. The moment stretched, too long, too still. Then he cleared his throat, looking toward the fire. You should turn in soon. Long day. Yeah, I said softly. Long day. I set my empty glass down and stood, but before I could move past him, he reached out, fingers brushing my sleeve. Just that, barely a touch. But it was enough to make every nerve in my body come alive. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. He let go first, and I stepped back, heart pounding. The air between us was thick with something neither of us could name. When I finally went to my room, I stood at the door for a moment, hands still trembling where he'd touched me. I could hear him moving around in the living room, the soft scrape of wood, the shift of the chair. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm. I couldn't tell if I was scared of him or of what I wanted him to do. The storm passed sometime before dawn. When I stepped out of the small bedroom, the world beyond the window looked washed clean. Mist rising from the lake, the forest dripping in silence. Everything felt quieter, softer. Even the air smelled new. Daniel was already outside. Through the window, I saw him by the dock, inspecting the damage. He moved slowly, carefully, like someone who knew how to make things last. The rain had left his flannel dark at the shoulders, and when he bent to tie off a loose rope, I found myself watching longer than I should have. I poured coffee just to have something to do with my hands. By the time he came in, his hair was damp, his palms dirty with lake mud. Couple of boards loose, he said. Nothing serious. Need help fixing them? He raised an eyebrow. You know which end of a hammer to hold? Mostly, I said, pretending offense. His laugh was low and warm, catching me off guard. We'll find out then. It was strange. How quickly the tension from the night before had softened into something lighter. Maybe the storm had taken some of it with it. Or maybe we were just pretending. Either way, I followed him outside. We worked along the edge of the dock, side by side. The lake was calm again, a mirror of gray sky and rippling fog. Daniel showed me how to drive the new nails in straight, how to hold the board tight so it wouldn't split. His voice was calm, patient, steady. You're a quick learner, he said after I managed not to smash my thumb for the 3rd time. Good teacher, I said. He grinned faintly. Don't get used to compliments around here. Noted. The rhythm of the work was easy, almost hypnotic. He'd hand me the hammer, I'd pass him nails. We spoke less and less, but the silence wasn't awkward. Every now and then our shoulders brushed when we reached for the same tool. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining the way my chest tightened when it happened. By noon, the sun had burned through the mist. The cabin roof dripped steadily behind us. Daniel poured water from a jug, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Good as new," he said, surveying the dock. "Better," I said, without thinking. He looked at me, long enough for me to feel it but didn't reply. We ate lunch on the porch, watching the clouds drift across the lake. He'd found an old jar of pickles and some leftover soup, and we ate with our sleeves rolled, boots still muddy. It was simple, quiet. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. "Evan ever tell you why I built this place?" I shook my head. "Didn't want to be around people," he said, like it was a punchline. "After the divorce, I started coming up here weekends. Then 1 week turned into a year. Guess solitude's cheaper than therapy." I smiled softly. "And it works." He took a sip of coffee. "Most days." The tone wasn't bitter, just honest. I could feel the years between us in that moment, not like a wall but like a map of everything I hadn't lived yet. When he glanced at me, the look wasn't teasing anymore. It was something else, curiosity again, but gentler. "You don't talk about yourself much," he said. "There's not much to say." "I don't believe that." I looked away toward the water. "You ever get tired of being asked questions you don't know how to answer?" He chuckled. "All the time." There was something oddly comforting about his presence. He didn't push, didn't fill the silence with noise, just sat there, letting the world exist around us. And yet, that same quiet made it harder to hide the things I didn't want to say aloud. Later, we took the old rowboat out onto the lake. The air was crisp, sunlight spilling through breaks in the clouds. Daniel rowed. I trailed my fingers in the cold water. "Used to take Evan out here when he was a kid," he said, steadying the oars. "He'd pretend to fish, but mostly just talk." "Sounds like him," I said, smiling. "He said you were the quiet one." "Still am." He looked at me, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Then I'll talk for both of us." For a while, he did. Stories about rebuilding the roof, winters when the snow came up to the windowsills, a black bear once wandering through the yard. His voice carried easily over the water. When he paused, I asked, "You like being out here alone?" "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes I forget what I'm missing until someone shows up." He met my gaze for a fraction too long. I didn't look away this time. By evening, the sky bruised violet and gold. We'd chopped some firewood and cooked dinner, simple stew, eaten straight from the pot. The electricity was still unreliable, so Daniel lit lanterns and a few candles, their glow flickering off the cabin walls. He went to the shelf and pulled out a vinyl record, dusting it carefully. "You like old music?" "I like whatever doesn't sound like traffic," I said. He smiled at that, setting the record on the turntable. The needle crackled, and a soft piano filled the room. An old tune, melancholy and warm. Daniel sank into the chair by the fire, boots unlaced, drink in hand. I sat across from him, watching the way the firelight painted his face in amber. His expression had softened, the edges of his stoicism smoothed by the music. "This was my mother's record," he said quietly. "Used to play it when she cooked dinner. I found it again after she passed. I didn't know you kept things like that." He shrugged. "You'd be surprised what survives us." I studied him for a moment, the calm, the sadness tucked into his smile. He looked like someone who had learned how to be alone but never quite made peace with it. When he turned toward me again, his voice dropped. "You remind me of the version of myself I never got to be." The words hung there, heavy and impossible to ignore. I didn't know how to respond. A dozen thoughts raced through me. Flattery, confusion, guilt. I wanted to ask what he meant, but part of me already knew. He looked away first, running a hand through his hair. "Forget it. Too much whiskey, not enough sense." But I couldn't forget it. Not the tone, not the way he said it, soft, like a truth he'd been carrying for too long. The record played on. Rain began again, lighter this time, tapping softly against the window. He stood to adjust the lantern, the flame dimming for a moment. When he passed it to me, our hands met, just barely, but neither of us pulled away. The contact lingered, skin against skin, heat where there shouldn't have been any. I could hear my pulse louder than the rain. He looked at me, eyes steady, unreadable. I didn't move, afraid that any motion would break whatever fragile thing had formed between us. Then he cleared his throat and stepped back, as if realizing how close we were. "You should get some rest," he said quietly. "It's been a long day." I nodded, though I didn't want to move. My fingers still tingled where they'd touched. He blew out one of the candles, leaving only the fire's glow. For a few seconds, his silhouette flickered across the walls. Broad shoulders, silver at the temples. Hands that built things and fixed things and now seemed to be holding themselves still. "Good night, Daniel," I said softly. He hesitated at the threshold. "Good night, Jamie." The way he said my name, it wasn't just a word. It was a tether. Back in my room, I lay awake listening to the old record finish its song. The last notes crackled and faded into static, and still I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying that moment by the lantern. The warmth of his hand, the quiet between us, the look that said more than either of us would ever admit. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I was imagining it, reading too much into the silence. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted, and no matter how much I wanted to believe the line between us was still clear, it wasn't anymore. By the next evening, the cabin felt smaller. The rain had returned, softer this time but steady, a constant whisper against the windows. The lake had disappeared again into mist. Even the air inside seemed thicker, crowded by everything we hadn't said. Daniel moved around quietly, tending the fire, checking the lanterns, doing the things he always did. But every small sound seemed sharper, every glance longer. When our eyes met, we both looked away too fast. It wasn't the storm outside that made the air heavy. It was us. I thought maybe the feeling would fade, that a night's sleep and a little distance would make things normal again. But it hadn't. The space between us kept shrinking, no matter how far apart we stood. When he finally broke the silence, it was with something simple. "Drink." I hesitated. "Sure." He poured whiskey into 2 glasses and handed me one. His hand brushed mine, brief, casual, devastating. We sat across from each other at the table, the firelight painting the room gold and red. The wind outside pressed against the walls. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "You ever get tired of people pretending they know who you are?" I looked up, surprised by the question. "All the time." He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on his glass. "When my wife left, she said I was too hard to read. Said I lived like I was hiding something, even when I wasn't. Were you? Maybe. Or maybe I just didn't know how to be understood." He took another drink, the fire catching the edge of his profile, the lines around his mouth, the silver at his temples, the quiet in his eyes. I found myself saying, people always think quiet means closed off, but sometimes it just means no one ever asked the right question. He smiled faintly, almost to himself. "You ever think you ask too many right questions?" "Only when I care about the answer." That made him look up. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was something else. Something charged, fragile. The air seemed to pulse with it. We talked after that. Not about the weather or work or Evan. About lonelier things. He told me he hated birthdays. That he hadn't spoken to his brother in years. That sometimes he'd wake up here at the cabin and forget what day it was, and that it scared him how little it mattered. I told him about the city, the noise that never stopped, the people who mistook closeness for connection, the nights that felt too crowded to be lonely but were anyway. At some point, our words began to slow, to sink into quieter spaces between them. He stared at the fire, glass still in his hand. "You remind me of the part of myself I thought was long gone," he said softly. My chest tightened. "You said that before." "I meant it both times." He leaned back in his chair, eyes on me now. "You're not the first to look at me that way." I froze. "What way?" He didn't flinch. "Like you don't know if you're supposed to." The breath caught in my throat. He continued, quieter. "But you're the first I've wanted to look back at." The words hit me like a pulse. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. He looked away then, running a hand through his hair. And that's the problem. My voice came out rough. Why? He laughed once, bitterly. Because you're too young. Because you're Evan's friend. Because it's wrong on paper, even if it doesn't feel that way right now. I didn't know how to argue with that. Maybe I didn't want to. I stared into the fire, the flickering light blurring my vision. You think I don't know that? He glanced at me. Then why are you still sitting here? Why are you? Neither of us answered. The storm outside deepened. The wind rattled the shutters. A flash of lightning threw our shadows against the wall. Two figures close but not touching. He stood first, pacing once before turning toward the window. I've done a lot of things I regret, he said. I don't want this to be one of them. His voice cracked on the last word, just slightly. I rose too, unable to stay seated anymore. Then stop pretending like you don't feel it. He turned then, fast, sharp, like he hadn't expected me to say it. His eyes caught mine, full of something between anger and longing. Careful, he said. Of what? Of meaning it. Another flash of lightning lit the room, and in that heartbeat of brightness, he looked older and younger all at once. Haunted, alive, terrified. The thunder rolled, shaking the window panes, and something in me broke open. I took a step toward him. He didn't move. Another step. Jamie, he said, warning and plea in the same breath. I reached out, barely touching his sleeve. The world felt smaller than the space between my hand and his. For a moment, neither of us breathed. Then he closed the distance. The kiss wasn't planned. It wasn't even graceful. It was desperate, sudden, the kind of moment that existed outside of sense. His hand came up to my face, rough and trembling. Mine found his chest, feeling the steady thrum beneath. For a few seconds, the world was just heat and rain and heartbeat. And then he pulled away. The silence afterward was worse than the thunder. Daniel stepped back, eyes wide, breathing uneven. We shouldn't have, he said. His voice was low, broken. I swallowed, words sticking in my throat. I know. He turned away, running a hand down his face. You should get some sleep. Daniel, please. I stopped. There was something in his tone that ended the conversation before it began. He moved to the table, collecting the empty glasses like nothing had happened, like the air wasn't still burning. The sound of glass against wood was painfully loud. I stood there, unsure whether to speak or leave. Finally, I said, I didn't mean. Yes, you did, he said softly, not looking at me. That's the problem. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The quiet hurt more. When I finally turned toward the hallway, my hands were shaking. In the small bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, heart still pounding. The rain kept falling, tapping against the window like a reminder that the world hadn't stopped just because we had. I pressed my palms to my face. The smell of smoke and whiskey clung to my skin. I told myself it was nothing, a mistake, a moment twisted by loneliness and weather. But that wasn't true. It wasn't nothing. It was everything I'd been afraid to feel since the first night I saw him standing in that doorway. Tired, quiet, and somehow magnetic. I thought about Evan, about the absurdity of it all. About the years between us, the rules we'd just broken without meaning to. Guilt settled heavy in my chest, but beneath it, something else, something worse, wanting. I lay back, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second. The warmth of his mouth, the sound of his breath, the way he'd said my name before pulling away. Outside, thunder rolled again, low and distant. Inside, I couldn't stop shaking. At some point, I must have drifted into something between sleep and thought. I dreamed of the lake, endless and silver, with Daniel standing on the dock, looking back at me but never speaking. When I woke, the fire had gone out. The cabin was cold. I could hear him moving in the next room. Slow, careful, as if afraid of making noise. I wanted to go to him. I didn't. I stayed still, watching the faint light from under the door until it disappeared. And for the first time since arriving, I wished the storm hadn't stopped. At least then, The thunder could drown out the sound of what I'd done. Morning came gray and damp, the kind of light that felt like hesitation. The storm had finally passed, but its echo remained in the dripping eaves, in the smell of rain-soaked wood, in the uneasy quiet between us. When I stepped into the main room, Daniel was already dressed, boots laced, coat on, as if preparing to leave even though there was nowhere to go. He was stacking firewood by the hearth, movements precise, deliberate, almost mechanical. "Morning," I said. He didn't turn around. "Coffee's on the stove." His voice was calm, but it wasn't warm. Not the kind of calm that settled things, the kind that built walls. I poured a mug, the steam rising between us like a veil. "You sleep. Enough." The lie sat plainly in the air. I wanted to ask if he'd thought about last night, if he felt what I did, the collision of guilt and longing, the way something forbidden could still feel true. But he didn't look at me once, and that silence said everything. Outside, the yard was slick with mud. The storm had left the dock half-flooded and one of the trees near the porch leaning dangerously. Daniel grabbed an axe and went to work clearing fallen branches. I followed, mostly to escape the weight inside the cabin. We didn't speak as we worked. Just the thud of wood and the rhythm of effort. Two people trying to make sense of something they couldn't fix. Once, when he lifted a log onto the pile, our eyes met. He looked away so quickly it almost hurt to watch. By noon, the rain had turned to drizzle. I walked down to the edge of the lake, staring at the ripples spreading across the surface. The reflection of the sky looked fractured, just like the space between us. I thought about packing my things, leaving before we made it worse. But when I checked my phone, there was still no signal. The dirt road beyond the trees was half-flooded, impassable. Even if I wanted to leave, I couldn't. I laughed bitterly to myself, trapped by weather and by something else I couldn't name. Back inside, Daniel was at the table, wiping his hands clean. He glanced up briefly when I entered. "The main road's washed out," he said. "I checked earlier." I nodded. "So I'm stuck." "Looks like it." The way he said it, flat, almost indifferent, stung more than anger would have. We ate lunch in silence. Soup reheated from last night, spoons scraping quietly against bowls. Every small sound felt magnified in the absence of words. I finally set my spoon down. "You can't pretend it didn't happen." He froze. For a moment, neither of us breathed. Then he said, still not looking at me, "I'm not pretending." "Yes, you are." His jaw tightened. "What do you want me to say, Jamie?" "The truth." He pushed his chair back slightly, exhaling through his nose. "The truth is, it shouldn't have happened. But it did." He met my eyes for the first time all day. "And now what?" I didn't have an answer. Maybe there wasn't one. He leaned back, arms crossed. "You think I don't know what people would say? Evan, my family, anyone who hears about it. You think they'd see what really happened? No, they'd just see wrong." "Maybe they would," I said softly. "But that doesn't make it a lie." He shook his head, laughing under his breath. But there was no humor in it. "You're too young to understand how fast people turn something human into something ugly." "Then explain it to me," I said. His hands tightened into fists on the table. "You think I haven't spent half my life trying not to be seen as the wrong kind of man? You think it's easy to look at someone who could have a life ahead of him and know I'd only ruin it?" The words hit like thunder, quiet but shaking everything inside me. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that what I felt wasn't damage but clarity. But the look on his face stopped me. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Not of me, of himself. He rubbed a hand over his face, voice lowering. "You didn't do anything wrong. I should have stopped it before it started." I swallowed hard. "But you didn't." His gaze flickered, pain, regret, and something else that refused to die. "No," he admitted. "I didn't." We sat there in the silence that followed, surrounded by the faint hiss of rain and the ticking of the stove. For a long time, neither of us spoke. When he finally did, his voice was quieter. "You want to know what scares me the most?" I nodded. "That I meant it," he said. "That for 1 second, it didn't feel wrong at all." I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his eyes. It didn't for me either. That was the closest we'd come to honesty since the kiss. The words hovered between us, fragile and real. He reached for his glass, fingers trembling slightly. "We're two lonely people who let the storm get to us," he said, almost convincing himself. "That's all it is." "Is it?" He hesitated, then sighed. "No, but it has to be." The ache in his voice settled deep inside me. I wanted to argue, to tell him that what happened came from something bigger than loneliness, that it wasn't a mistake but a moment of truth neither of us had expected. But maybe he already knew that. Maybe admitting it would only make it worse. So instead, I said quietly, "You can't spend your whole life being afraid of who you are." He gave a small, sad smile. "You'd be surprised how many people do." The fire popped, sending a small ember into the air. He stood and went to tend it, kneeling by the hearth. I watched him there, the flicker of flame lighting the side of his face. There was something heartbreaking about him. A man who'd spent so long building walls that he forgot how to live without them. Late afternoon, the phone on the counter finally buzzed weakly. A single bar of signal. Daniel wiped his hands and answered before I could move. "Evan." His tone softened instantly. "You all right?" A pause. Then a short, tired laugh. "Yeah, I figured." He turned toward me, phone still to his ear. "He's not coming," he said. "Car trouble. Stuck in the city." For a second, the irony was too much to bear. I almost laughed, the kind that hurts on the way out. Daniel hung up and set the phone down. "He said he'll try next weekend, right?" The silence that followed was unbearable. He leaned against the counter, looking at me with something unreadable. "Guess it's just us again." The way he said it, resigned, almost tender, made something twist in my chest. The sky dimmed early, clouds stretching low and heavy. We made dinner without speaking much. The normalcy felt like acting in a play we'd both forgotten the lines to. Afterward, I washed the dishes while he dried them. Our hands brushed once. Neither of us flinched this time, but neither lingered either. Just contact, quiet and real. When we finished, he said, "You should get some rest. Roads might clear by tomorrow." "I'll stay tonight," I said, surprising both of us. He frowned slightly. "You don't have to." "I know." I didn't explain why. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I wanted to see if the silence could hold something gentler than regret. He nodded once, then turned to check the windows. The small gestures, folding the towel, banking the fire, carried the weight of words unspoken. Later, we sat by the fire again, as we had so many times before. The room felt smaller still, but not suffocating. Just honest. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "For what?" "For wanting something I shouldn't." I stared into the flames. "Then we're both guilty." He exhaled, eyes on the fire. "You'll go back to the city. You'll forget this place." "I'll try," I said. "But I don't think I will." He gave a faint smile. "That's the problem with truth. Once you see it, you can't unsee it." For a long moment, we just watched the fire. The sound of rain softened outside, turning to mist. When he looked at me again, there was no denial left, no performance of restraint. Just a quiet sadness, and something that almost looked like peace. That night, when I lay in bed, the cabin no longer felt like a cage. Felt like confession. The storm had stripped everything down. The walls, the fear, the pretending. What was left wasn't love, not exactly. But it was real. I knew I'd leave soon. I also knew part of me would stay here, in the crackle of the fire, in the sound of rain against wood, in the way Daniel had looked at me not with lust or regret, but recognition. We were both people who had built lives around silence. And for a brief, impossible moment, we'd broken it. When I closed my eyes, I could still hear his voice. Quiet, steady, human. "Good night, Jamie." It didn't sound like an ending. Just the truth, spoken softly in the dark. The morning after felt different. No rain. No thunder. No haze of guilt or confusion. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't demand silence, only honors it. The sunlight touched the lake like liquid silver, sliding between the trees and scattering across the water. Mist clung to the surface, then lifted slowly, like the world was taking a breath for the first time in days. I stepped onto the porch barefoot, coffee warming my hands. The boards were cool and damp beneath my feet, the air sharp with pine and earth. The storm had left its mark. Branches scattered across the yard, the dock half submerged. But it all looked cleaner somehow, as if ruin and renewal had always been the same thing. Daniel was already outside, sitting on the steps. He didn't look surprised to see me. "Morning," he said. His voice was soft, roughened by sleep and something quieter than words. "Morning." He nodded toward the mug in my hand. "Made it strong today. Figured we both needed it." "I'm not arguing." I sat beside him. The sunlight reached us in thin threads through the trees, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet soil. For a while, we didn't speak at all. Just watched the lake, its slow ripples reflecting the sky like a mirror that couldn't decide what to keep. It should have been awkward, two people who'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But it wasn't. There was no shame left in it. No panic, no pretending. Just quiet understanding. He broke the silence first. "Roads are clearing," he said. "I checked earlier. You could probably make it out after lunch." I nodded. "Yeah." The word felt both too small and too heavy. He took a sip from his mug, eyes on the horizon. "I didn't sleep much last night." "Me neither." I kept thinking about all of it. I waited. He continued, voice steady. "I don't regret the truth. I just wish I'd learned how to live with it sooner." The simplicity of that hit me harder than any apology could have. I turned my mug between my palms. "You don't have to explain." "I know," he said, "but I want to." He looked down at his hands, the same hands that built this place, that fixed what storms had broken. "When I was younger, I used to think being good meant not wanting the wrong things. Turns out I spent half my life confusing quiet for virtue." I smiled faintly. "You're not the only one." He huffed out a soft laugh. "Maybe not, but I'm old enough to know what happens when you keep cutting pieces off yourself just to fit where people think you belong." The words lingered in the morning air. A bird called somewhere in the distance. The sound felt like punctuation. He looked at me then, not as a man weighed down by guilt, but as someone who'd stopped running from himself. "You'll leave here, Jamie. You'll go back to the noise and the lights, and that's how it should be. But I want you to remember something." I met his gaze. "What's that?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "What we shared wasn't a mistake. It wasn't right by anyone else's measure, maybe, but it was real. And sometimes that has to be enough." The way he said it, steady, without apology, loosened something in me I hadn't realized was still knotted tight. We stayed there for a long time, the two of us framed by the sound of the world waking back up. Bees hovered near the porch steps. The lake glittered where the light caught it. I didn't know if I would see him again after this. Part of me didn't want to, not because I didn't care, but because leaving it here, unbroken, unspoiled, felt right. There was peace in the boundaries we couldn't keep but had finally stopped lying about. When I finally spoke, it came out almost as a thought. "We didn't need to call it love." He looked at me, eyes soft. I continued, "We just needed to stop pretending it wasn't real." He smiled, small, genuine, the kind that reached the corners of his eyes. "I can live with that." By mid-morning, the mist had burned away. Daniel went down to the dock with a toolbox and I followed. Together, we reset the planks that had lifted during the storm. It was quiet work, measured, purposeful, and it felt like closure more than repair. At one point, when I was holding a board steady, his hand brushed mine. Not by accident this time. He didn't pull away. For a few seconds, our hands stayed like that, still grounded, before he set the hammer down and squeezed lightly. Just once. A simple gesture. No hesitation. No fear. And that, somehow, said more than last night ever could. After lunch, I packed my bag. He didn't hover, didn't ask me to stay. Just stood by the door as I zipped it shut. The same quiet calm in his eyes that he'd had all morning. "Evan'll probably call again soon," I said, forcing a smile. "You can tell him the place survived." "Barely," he said, a small grin flickering across his face. But it's still standing. Like us. I slung the bag over my shoulder and hesitated. Do you ever think you'll leave this place? He looked around the cabin, the walls he'd built, the life he'd carved out of isolation. Maybe one day, he said. But not yet. There's still something here worth remembering. I nodded. Yeah, there is. The words felt heavier than I meant them to. He walked me to the porch. The lake shimmered beyond the trees, calm now, as if it had already forgotten the storm that had wrecked its surface. But I knew better. Water remembers everything that touches it. When we reached the truck, I hesitated again. The keys felt heavy in my pocket. He leaned against the railing, hands tucked into his jacket. Drive slow on the back road, he said. There's a washout near the bend. I nodded, then glanced up at him. You'll be all right? I've been all right a long time, he said softly. Doesn't mean I won't miss the company. The honesty in it almost undid me. I stepped closer, uncertain whether to shake his hand or just say goodbye. But before I could decide, he reached out and placed a hand against my shoulder. Warm, solid. Take care, Jamie. I met his gaze. You too, Daniel. We stood there for a moment. Not as strangers, not quite as anything else, until I finally got in the truck and started the engine. He lifted a hand in a small wave as I pulled away. The reflection of him in the rearview mirror shrank until it blurred into the trees. The road wound along the lake for several miles. I rolled down the window, the wind carrying the smell of pine and damp earth. The air felt lighter than when I'd arrived, like something inside me had been rinsed clean. I thought about the first night, the storm, the firelight, the way the world had shrunk to the space between us. How terrified I'd been of what I felt. How human it all seemed now. He hadn't saved me from loneliness. I hadn't rescued him from regret. But for a moment in time, we had seen each other fully, without disguise, without apology. That was its own kind of grace. I stopped at a small lookout point before leaving the valley. From there, I could see the cabin in the distance, half hidden by trees, smoke rising faintly from the chimney. The lake below it shimmered in the noon sun, smooth as glass. I closed my eyes and listened. The sound of the water was faint but familiar. A whisper, a rhythm I'd already learned by heart. Maybe it wasn't the cabin or the storm that had changed me. Maybe it was finding someone who looked at me and didn't look away. I let the thought settle there, quiet and true, before starting the engine again. As I drove away, the sunlight flashed off the lake one last time, blinding and beautiful. For a moment, it looked like the world was made of silver, and somewhere, deep beneath its surface, I knew the lake would remember.